Hey, beautiful creatives, welcome to Life I Design, the podcast. Thanks for joining me, your host, Nicki Traikos. I'm an artist, letterer, instructor, and creative business owner. I started and built Life I Design from home while raising a family and learning how to juggle it all. This podcast is my way of pulling back the curtain and inviting you to step into my home studio so we can get candid about all things art, business, and life so I can help you create a life that you design. Hello. Welcome back to A Life I Design, the podcast. Doing these episodes every few weeks now is really great in terms of just filling in my time and being able to work on other projects. But I feel like 2 weeks is a long time between episodes. I wonder if you feel the same. What if I told you that watercolor painting can be enjoyable and easy and even addictive to practice? Well, I'm telling you, it can be. Time to upgrade your watercolor skills and get a few more tips that will help you advance your skills and grow your watercolor confidence and even add some artistic style too. How does that sound? Welcome to episode 17 of Life I Design, the podcast, where I'm going to give you more direction for growing your watercolor skills and help you enjoy your painting practice even more. If you're new to watercolor painting and haven't listened to episode 7 of the podcast, go ahead and hit pause and have a listen to that episode. Then come back here and join me, okay? Episode 7 is where I gave you some of my favorite tips that I share with my watercolor students when they're just starting out with watercolor painting. So, tips that are designed more for the beginner. In this episode, I'm going to assume that you have a bit of watercolor painting experience under your belt, and maybe you've taken a class or two with me and you want some ideas and direction for growing your watercolor painting practice. Okay, so I'm hoping that you've painted a few pieces that you love, maybe ones that you didn't love so much. And I'm going to assume that you've learned how to mix your perfect watercolor puddle and you're enjoying exploring colors and you're excited about the ideas that are coming to mind for what you want to paint next. So let's get started with the tips, shall we? So when you first start out with watercolor, it's very common for me to see similar questions about supplies. I often get asked, what paper should I use? What paints are good for beginners? Should I get tubes or use the dry pans? And it's really hard for me to answer those questions because I always feel like you have to go with what works for A, your budget, B, where you live, because you'll have access to different supplies than I would. And even brands, because some brands are available in some areas, some are not. I have specific supplies that I use in my classes because it just gives the student an opportunity to pick up what I'm using and follow along more easily if that's the way they like to learn. But there really isn't a one answer fits all. So I'm normally a little bit hesitant around recommending a specific brand or a specific color, unless, of course, you're in one of those classes. And then I share with you exactly what I'm using. But I'm a little hesitant because I don't want that to stop you. So don't let the idea of supplies and what paper and what paints you should get stop you. There are so many different levels of quality and so many amazing brands, and they're all kind of similar from brand to brand. I did do a comparison between two higher end brands in the same color. I didn't realize I'd bought the same tube from both of these brands, and they were identical when I swatched either tube on the same piece of watercolor paper. Okay, so don't let the idea of supplies and what you should get and make sure you get the right one bog you down, because there isn't a straight point answer for supplies and what you should get. Okay, but now that you're a little bit more savvy with watercolor, so again, you've gone from beginner to someone who's more of a savvy watercolorist and you have some experience under your belt, it is now time for you to upgrade your watercolor supplies. So this is when you should upgrade and get the best quality watercolor paper that you can afford. And when you're doing that, again, I'm not going to say buy the specific brand or buy the specific quality. What I will recommend is that you try to buy watercolor paper that's 100% cotton based or 100% cotton, period. So it should be paper that you can practice on a little bit to get a feel for it and not worry too much about the waste. You can always go back to your lower cost or lower quality paper if you're swatching colors or if you're getting warmed up, but try to slowly invest in a better quality paper. Now, what you'll notice is as soon as you change what paper you're painting on, you'll have a few wobbly moments. It's guaranteed. Changing your substrate can throw you off your game big time. It changes the way the watercolor wash and consistency happens across the page. It can change the way your brush stroke moves across the page, even. And also, it can change how your watercolor pigments dry. Okay, so give yourself time to practice, to play around with your new watercolor paper, and give yourself time to adapt. Okay. For an advanced class that I'm teaching, I got a selection of new watercolor papers to test, and I think I bought maybe 3 or 4 different pads, all different brands, different qualities, because I want to show my students what the differences are. And sometimes I'm just curious myself. And man, it threw me off big time, I have to say. I was wobbly and feeling a little unsure with my strokes too, because I made that drastic change and went from what I'm used to now maybe a thicker paper or a paper that's a little bit more textured. And it completely changes how much water to put in your wash and even how slow or how quickly you need to be painting. Okay. But that's where you gather all of the techniques and tips that you've learned so that you can balance that change by adjusting. So I knew with the skills that I have with watercolor painting, how I have to tweak what my watercolor mix consistency is like, how much water maybe I need to have on my brush before I lay down that glaze on the watercolor paper. Okay. This is where we grow the most with our skills. We push ourselves out of that comfort zone and we really have that exciting moment where it's been wobbly, we're not liking what's happening, but then we get into that flow again, and suddenly you're working on beautiful paper that you love. Your confidence is right back on track, and you'll be surprised when you're working on that better quality paper how brilliant your pigment will look and just how saturated that color is as well. Okay. So, another thing that I suggest that you upgrade on, it should be your pigments. Now, I paint using watercolor tubes. I like that I can dispense just the right amount of watercolor pigment, add a touch of water, and get to painting. I like the pigment payoff that watercolor tubes offer, and I don't have time to wake up the dry squares of watercolor in those dry palettes and get that creamy consistency that I'm looking for. That's just my personal preference. Yours might be different, okay? However, if you've been painting for a while, you'll now have a good indication of what colors you're drawn to more than others. You'll start to notice that some tubes are running out more quickly than others, or the pans in your dry palette are becoming more empty than others. When those colors run out, it might be time to consider replacing them with an upgraded pigment. So if you're working with a student line, in that line of watercolors and brands, and again, I'm so apprehensive about naming a specific brand, but maybe at that point, it's time to replace those colors with the more professional line. So when you're replacing one color at a time, financially, it doesn't feel like a big investment. And then when you start to work with better quality pigment on better quality paper, you're going to love your results much better. So start to compare the pigments as you blend and mix and paint with the more professional version. And again, you'll notice that those more pigmented watercolors blend nicely, they dry more consistently, and overall, it just improves the quality of your painting, okay? Which is happy. That's a happy thing. Again, keep in mind you don't have to break the bank when upgrading, so do it slowly as you grow so you can start to upgrade your watercolor supply kit slowly, one at a time. Okay, so next tip, it's kind of more of an artsy tip than a watercolor tip, but I think one that you can use for whatever medium you're working on, especially if you're a beginner and just getting into the groove and feeling like, hey, I've got my footing, I know what I'm doing, I feel confident. What I suggest you start working on as you're building that watercolor confidence and skills is that you should be painting what speaks to you. I've probably mentioned this before. Hopefully I have, but it's something that I feel if you focus on painting things that speak to you, that will create just this excitement, more connection to what you're doing, and it'll inspire you to paint more. So if you've been following me on Instagram or in any of my classes, you'll know this already, but I love leaves. Leaves, stems, flowers, botanicals. Nature pretty much is where I look for my motifs that I want to paint, and imagery to draw. Okay. They're often illustrative in nature and very simple in form, and in most cases, quite minimalistic. But I paint these things and in this style because it's what I love. So when you paint things that you love, you'll sit down to paint more and explore how you can express them in your own personal style. And when you have that consistency that you're creating with working on similar motifs, similar shapes, and even that organic, for me in my case, that organic style, you'll actually grow your skill even more because of that repetition. Okay. But my next tip is going to be more focused on exploring what you love to paint and then learn how to draw it. And yes, I mean sketching, drawing, creating a copy of what it is that you want to focus on. That's a huge part of advancing your watercolor skills. So you don't have to learn how to draw in a traditional or formal sense. Just learn how to look at focal points and be able to pick them out. Understand how to sketch so the perspective is interesting. It doesn't even have to be proper. I'm not even asking you to sketch things so that they are direct reflection or very realistic in what you're observing. What I want you to do is be able to sketch what an open flower looks like and examine what makes it interesting and unique. And then as you explore your sketching, you can move that onto your painting and decide how you want to artistically express that peony, for instance. Okay, so it doesn't have to look identical to a peony, but what I want you to do is understand what the shapes, the leaves look like, and what the center of the flower looks like, and the shape of the leaves and how they grow out of the peony, and then decide how you want to express that artistically. So, will it be loose and impressionistic in style? Maybe you love realism. So, will that peony look realistic? Or will you create just an abstract interpretation mimicking maybe the idea of a peony with the colors and the shape, but have it looked really abstract in form? So start to paint as you see things or how you want to express what you're painting. So try using things like non-traditional colors or mix an interesting variety of colors. Allow yourself the freedom to create something unique or bring in your own unique take is really what I'm encouraging you to do. Okay, so learn from others and then play around with what you've learned and make it you. This takes practice and this takes consistent practice. But as soon as you get into that mode of creating something that feels like you and you see that reflected in multiple pieces, it really is exciting. So I encourage you to do that. Okay, so let's get back to chatting about watercolor techniques, shall we? As you build your watercolor experience, things you should be working on more is how to paint and build washes of color so that you can start to add really nice depth and interest to your watercolor pieces. So, watercolor is a beautiful medium to work with, and it's one that offers a really gorgeous transparency. And when it's dry, you can really observe beautiful texture and just brush strokes. It's the only medium, in my opinion, and really, I can't imagine any other mediums, and I work with so many. It's the only medium that offers that beautiful transparency and that depth of hue. So you get a beautiful range even within a single brush stroke. Okay, or value. You get a beautiful value range within that single brush strokes. So explore using very simple exercises to help you learn to build layers of value or of color, creating lights and darks so that you can really draw your eye into the piece. Although watercolor offers that great light wash of pigment, that transparency that we love so much, you really can build up the opacity with a few simple techniques based on how you mix your watercolor petals and even how many layers you paint over and over again. Okay? I know, so many good tips. I hope you've enjoyed the tips so far. Again, if you're a beginner and all of this is kind of feeling overwhelming to you and you're getting a little lost, maybe not understanding what I'm sharing 100%, go ahead, hit pause, and go back to episode 7. Okay, so you'll find some great tips there for just starting off and really, truly techniques that you should be learning if you're picking up watercolor as a medium. Okay, so let me share a few more with you. I've got a list. It's really good. So if you are looking to advance your watercolor skills, I'm going to give you some of my favorite tips that I feel like will really push you towards that advancing stage and will really help you fall more in love with watercolors too, hopefully. So, when you approach a painting with watercolors and you're unsure where to start painting, I recommend that you look to find the light and start there. Okay, so remember, always paint lightest to darkest when using watercolors and keep your lights as light as possible. And you can even leave the white of the paper. And then you can add a light layer to it to add another dimension at the end. So your lightest value is the white of the paper, and then it goes from there with whatever color you're using. So keep that in mind. If you're unsure of how to find the values in your painting, use a black and white photo of what you want to paint, and then start pulling out the values from that photo. So starting again from the whitest white, find some light grays, and then look for your medium grays, and then again to your darkest gray or black values. Okay. This will help train your eye so that you can learn more about building those same values in whatever you're painting using whatever watercolor color. Okay, so whatever hue you're using, you can build those same values based on working from light to dark. I have a really good exercise actually that I do in my advanced watercolor class. It's a bit of a warm up and that helps with teaching you how to create values and transparencies and getting to know a single color at a time. So, exercises like these are what I put into classes because I really design them so that you understand how to mix the perfect watercolor puddle, how to create those beautiful opacities, how to then add more water to your puddle so that you can create those transparencies and lighter values. And in the process, you're growing your watercolor skills. And in the end, you've got a beautiful little color story that you've created and for you to refer back to. Okay, so another important tip I have for any type of painting, even sketching, is going to help you with your art big time. If you're getting to a point with your painting where you think you're finished, but not quite sure if it needs a little something else, and you're having a hard time deciding, and you don't know if you should stop, and you don't want to mess it up, I'm going to help you with how to decide what to do and where to go. So, first off, if you get to the point, I say stop. Okay. Stop what you're doing, put it down, let everything settle in, let your watercolor dry into the paper, and then you're going to take a photo of it. Okay. Place it near direct light. Just bring it close to a window. It's the best place for you to take all of your photos. Okay. So use your natural light. Take a few photos of it. Take a photo of it straight on, observe what it looks like with some shadows, look at the composition, maybe take a different photo at a different angle, look at details. Where is your eye drawn to? If there's a heavy part of your painting that your eye keeps going back to, maybe that area needs to be blended more. Okay, so maybe look for areas that your eye is falling to. Work those areas, blend them, create a little bit more depth, and use just a little bit of paint at a time, making sure that you go slow, observe the changes you're making, and then you can decide at that point if you want to continue or if you want to add a little bit more. Okay, so work those areas a little bit at a time. Using a photograph is a really great way to see your piece with fresh eyes and in a different light. Okay, try it, and I'm sure it's going to help you get your paintings to the point where you feel like they are finished and that you're in control of making that decision. Okay. So, all of these watercolor tips are ones that I've just really created in the last couple of months because I've been knee deep in watercolors at the moment. I've spent the better half of January and all of February planning, sketching, recording my newest watercolor classes that I'm super excited to share with you. Watercolors Made Simple. It is 8+ hours of video instruction where I take you from the very beginning. And yep, we're talking supplies, color mixing, washes, much, much, much more. I show you in my personal style of watercolor painting, my approach to most of my art practices. And no, actually, scratch that. All of my art practices. It's how I approach painting, sketching, and designing in a very informal way so I can be free to be allowed to share and to create whatever needs to come out. Okay. And this is what I share with my students because doing this allows you to enjoy the process of painting without the pressure of the outcome. Watercolors Made Simple, it's open and it's welcoming new beginner watercolorists who just want a fun project to work on throughout the class, who maybe has a love for florals and leaves and stems like I do. And I've even thrown in a little bit of lettering too. So I want to invite you, if you enjoyed all the tips that I shared in this episode and in episode 7, go ahead and visit www.watercolorsmadesimple.com for more info about the class. You can even head over to Life I Design and it will link you to the class to show you all the amazing modules and lessons that I have available for you there. Wherever you are in your watercolor painting journey, create a little ritual around why you're painting, who you're making it for, and that should be you first and foremost. Enjoy beautiful colors on your watercolor paper and even get some tips to help you fall in love with what you're creating. I even have a fun traceable watercolor motif ebook that I created recently. And I provide you with traceable motifs that will help you get painting and not struggling with the drawing part of your art. So you can trace things like wreaths and florals and stems, and of course, my favorite, houseplants. You'll find that on my site at lifeidesign.com. So that's it for this episode. I feel like I've laid down lots of tips, given you lots of advice. I hope you've enjoyed it. And I hope you're painting even while you're listening to this one. As always, please share this podcast with anyone who you feel needs to connect, who needs to learn a few tips, and maybe even get inspired to try something new. So, subscribe, share, and tune in. And thank you for spending this time with me. And until next time, happy creating. Bye for now.